Recently I found myself thinking about the question of net neutrality. And in thinking about this, I was reminded of a distinction that I first encountered, maybe 20 years ago from Larry Lessig between different ways that human societies can go about constructing how we uh, do things together. Specifically, the distinctions between laws, norms, and code. So first, I just lay out what that distinction is, and then maybe do a little bit of thinking about how it can be applied to this question of net neutrality. So norms are the baseline in many ways. They're the base mechanism that human societies use to condition the behavior of members. A norm might be don't speak too loudly when you're in a public place, or a norm might be always wear clothes, things like that. And the basic idea is that human beings are very sensitive, for obvious long-term Aboriginal tribal reasons, to the social esteem or social censure of other members of the tribe. And so when we go about doing things that are in violation of social norms, we receive some kind of social censure, and that inhibits our behavior. Shame is actually an aspect of this mechanic. And as a consequence, by the way, norms show up as a very powerful mechanism for social behavioral management in small, tight-knit communities. If we all grow up in the same place, we all grow up together, we all grow up sharing the same norms, on the one hand, everybody more or less understands what those norms are. And on the other hand, people have more agency in enforcing the norms. And so as a consequence, the norms work out pretty well. Whereas by contrast, if we're in an environment where, let's say, a very large cosmopolitan city with a very heterogeneous group of people with a lot of flow through it, where it's not obvious that any person who you interact with may even share the norms that you have, norms end up being vastly less important in conditioning behavior. There's still a baseline of norms constantly, but they cover a much larger percentage of human behaviors, for good and for ill. I mean, there's whole critiques of small towns and how insular they can be. And then we come to laws. So in the case of a law, we're looking at something which is, in some sense, a relatively modern invention. We've been doing norms for hundreds of thousands of years, probably actually more in the direction of small-digit millions. Laws, we even have an identification, Hammurabi's code, the notion of creating an explicit code and specific enforcement mechanisms to, again, condition human behavior. And I would suggest that, I guess, Rome, which was well known for its explicit laws, Byzantium, which was well known for its explicit laws, and then the modern era, the emergence of republics, constitutional republics, which are founded on a founding document in the domain of law, are some of the characteristic societies where law has been central and crucial. And so law is a situation where there is some explicit articulation of what is appropriate behavior and some mechanism for evaluating whether or not somebody has violated the law and then enforcing against those violations. Pretty straightforward. I think we're all pretty familiar with that modality. And if we extend that to include regulatory agencies, which I think is necessary, then we can say that the 20th century, I think, has been the high watermark of both the presentation, the penetration of law into social life, and its sort of specificity and nuance. So with the ability to use regulation and regulatory agencies, we developed a quite robust capacity for law to modulate human behavior, and again, for good and for ill. And it has certainly succeeded in certain ways and failed in other ways, which then brings us to the third category. The third category is code. Now, code is omnipresent in the form of the laws of nature. So that which goes up must come down is a nice, pithy example of code. And it shows up also in human design. So the way that we, say, design our urban environments. If there simply is not a road here, then driving here is, if not impossible, at least difficult. If there's not a bridge, then crossing the canyon has certain conditions. So oftentimes we'll perceive code as showing up in biological or in architectural constraints for most of history. And sometimes, in fact, this is, I think, what Lessig had to make it explicit, is simply implicit, that we just accept code as being, well, again, the laws of nature, the context in which laws and norms play out. But his point is that we've now entered into an era where we have enough power, and we live in such a, not just a built environment, but a fluidly built environment, in the context particularly of software, that code is now coming into its own. And so just kind of just put it in context by giving a simple example that includes all three. Let's say that there is a sense or a choice or a shared sentiment that it turns out that if you park a car on a hill, if you don't park the wheels pointing the right way, sometimes the car will roll down the hill to disastrous consequences. And so we've decided that it's a good idea to park your wheels a certain way when you park a car on a hill. In the land of norms, this will show up as it is just what you do. And to violate that norm will involve other people sending you social signals that you've done something wrong, icky, disgusting, bad. Maybe they put a flyer underneath your windshield wiper telling you that you're doing bad things, or they just give you dirty looks or whatever. And in the land of norms, this social feedback would be enough to condition your behavior, and everybody would do the right thing. Obviously, in the modern environment, we're all familiar with the fact that this is against the law in most places. And so in this case, what ends up happening is that first there's a law that you must do this. It's codified in some fashion. And then if you fail to do it, the police are empowered to put the piece of paper under your windshield, in this case in the form of a ticket, and it comes associated not with dirty looks, but some kind of fine, or possibly even potentially jail time, some sort of enforcement mechanism that is designed to make it so that you make the mental calculus of, well, it's more costly to run the risk of getting caught and being enforced against than it is to just do the thing that the law tells me to do. And so, generally speaking, everybody chooses to do the thing the law tells you to do. So it's a kind of a utilitarian calculus, Oliver Wendell Holmes model. But then you have code. So in the code case, what ends up happening is you could imagine, say, you have a Tesla car that has a software control structure and some pretty robust AI, and there's just a code update that causes the car itself by itself, that when it finds itself parked on a hill, to turn the wheels the right way. So what's notable about code is that on the one hand, it has this sensibility of ease, that we don't have to deal with enforcement, and we don't have to deal with compliance. It just is the way that it is. And so on the one hand, it's nice. It's very, very easy. On the other hand, of course, it is a form of tyranny that is never really ever going to show up in the lands of laws or norms. To route around code actually requires an enormous amount of capacity. You literally have to be able to hack the software in your car to avoid this thing happening. And so as we're entering into the era of code, it is now crucial to be mindful, again, of the difference between code and law and norms, and the difference in potential, the different kinds of things that we can do that simply cannot be done at all in the world of laws or norms, and also the pitfalls, the things that happen when we are not careful. Joe Edelman, for example, has written extensively on the degree to which we are already very much in the world of code, say, for example, in the ways that we can interact as a consequence of the architectural choices that were made by designers living far away, in the social media structures or the phone app structures that we interact with. If your app only has thumbs up, thumbs down, then that just constrains your behavior, regardless of your choice, and very effectively, I should add. So then let's think about this in the context of net neutrality. And on the one hand, recently, there's been a major change in the state of the law. And I noticed, for example, that the AT&T Corporation overtly called on the Senate or Congress to formally re-regulate net neutrality, so pull it out of the hands of a regulatory agency and codify it more fundamentally in the form of law. And this was the event that brought this distinction to my mind, because honestly, I sort of aesthetically felt it was a little bit old-fashioned to imagine that Congress and legislative lawmaking is appropriate, capable, effective in attempting to solve this problem. And that it seems to me, just sort of intuitively, that perhaps we should more closely consider code as the modality that is right here. And how would we do that? So for example, the code approach would not be along the lines of let's decide what good behavior is and then regulate or articulate that in some language. Well, articulate that in a law, but rather, how do we actually design it into the architecture itself? So, for example, one could imagine code in the net neutrality by creating a very, very decentralized physical internet where it would become impossible for anyone to force people to constrain their speech in some important way, just because the ability to route around that kind of censorship or the ability to route around that kind of friction would just be intrinsically so high because of the nature of the way the network itself was architected that you wouldn't need to regulate it. It would just be foolishly unnecessary. And this sort of stuff actually does exist in certain circumstances. If you observe, for example, the way that Bitcoin was very carefully architected without any access or capacity to use laws. It did actually have the ability to access norms, and that does show up. But it is predominantly built around the ability to use code to condition behavior. And in this case, it had to imagine game theoretic models of how people would make different choices around when they would apply their resources to mining and when would they defect and how would you police it. I mean, in some sense, the essence of Bitcoin is to consider how does one build relatively complex social systems almost exclusively out of code. And being as we are in this era of code, I would put it to you to consider and to think about how we can go about solving problems like net neutrality using code, why that might be, in fact, not just the best, but maybe even the only way in the contemporary environment, moving as rapidly as it does. And how do we build the collective skillfulness to do so well, recognizing the enormous hazards that are associated with building things into the laws of nature?